cafeteria went silent. Forks stopped clattering. Conversations died mid-sentence. The old man stood there, gray hair, sunken eyes, trembling hands gripping his tray. He didn't fight back, didn't even look up. Then smack. The sound cracked through the air like a gunshot. The guard's smirk spread slow, proud. "That's how we keep order," he muttered. But order doesn't survive long in a place built on fear. 40 prisoners watched. Not one said a word. But behind those silent stares, something shifted. A promise was made. That night, when the lights went out, the guard wasn't the one giving orders anymore. Stay with me till the end, because what they did next wasn't revenge. It was a lesson written in blood. Before we begin, don't forget to like this video, hit subscribe, and comment where you're watching from. Now let's get into it. The steel corridors of Bridgewater State Correctional Facility had seen their share of violence. Fights broke out weekly. Guards wielded their authority like hammers against nails that refused to stay down. But what happened on that Tuesday afternoon in October would become legend among inmates for decades to come. This wasn't just another power play gone wrong. This was the moment when crossing the line became a death sentence. Officer Derek Mason had been working the blocks for 8 years. 6'2", built like a linebacker with arms that could break bones and a temper that could ignite faster than gasoline meeting flame. He ruled his section through intimidation and brutality. The warden knew it. The other guards knew it. Hell, even the inmates' families knew it when they visited on weekends and saw the fresh bruises. But Mason had one rule that kept him employed and kept the administration looking the other way. He never left marks where the cameras could see them. Smart man, calculated. Every blow landed in blind spots. Every threat whispered in corridors without surveillance. For 8 years, he had perfected the art of invisible violence. That morning started like any other. The sun barely crept through the barred windows as inmates shuffled toward the cafeteria for breakfast. The smell of burnt coffee and watery eggs filled the air. Conversations hummed at that careful volume prisoners learned to master. Loud enough to seem normal, quiet enough to avoid attention. 73-year-old Harold Bennett moved through the line with the patience of a man who had learned that rushing only brought trouble. His weathered hands shook slightly as he accepted his tray from the kitchen worker. Parkinson's disease had been eating away at his motor control for 3 years now. The tremors made simple tasks like holding a spoon an exercise in concentration. Harold wasn't supposed to be in a place like Bridgewater. His crime was financial, embezzlement from the accounting firm where he had worked for 28 years. $15,000 taken over 6 months to pay for his wife's cancer treatments. Insurance had denied claim after claim, and desperation had driven him to make choices that landed him in general population alongside murderers and drug dealers. The other inmates mostly left him alone. Old men in prison occupied a strange space. Too weak to be threats, too experienced to be easy targets. Harold kept to himself, read books from the library, and counted down the days until his 18-month sentence ended. But Officer Mason had noticed him. Something about the old man's quiet dignity irritated him like a splinter under the skin. The way Harold said yes, sir, and no, sir, with genuine respect instead of the mocking tone most inmates used. It felt wrong somehow, like the old man was playing by different rules in a game where respect was earned through fear. The incident started small, the way forest fires begin with a single spark. Harold had been carrying his breakfast tray toward an empty table when his trembling hands betrayed him. The plastic cup of orange juice tilted, spilling its contents across the floor in a sticky orange stream. The cafeteria noise continued around him as Harold bent down, using napkins from his tray to clean up the mess. His movements were slow, careful. The Parkinson's made bending difficult, but he persevered with the methodical patience of someone who refused to be defeated by his own body. That's when Mason appeared. The guard had been making his morning rounds, that slow, predatory walk that guards perfected to remind everyone who held the power. When he saw the spill, something in his expression shifted. His jaw tightened. His steps quickened. "What the hell do you think you're doing, old man?" Harold looked up from where he knelt on the floor, napkins soaked with orange juice in his shaking hands. "Just cleaning up my spill, Officer Mason. Sorry about the mess." The respectful tone should have diffused the situation. Any reasonable person would have nodded and moved on. But Mason wasn't interested in reason. He was interested in making a point in front of 40 inmates who had suddenly gone very quiet, watching this interaction unfold with the keen attention of people who understood that violence could explode without warning. "You think this is your house, old-timer? Think you can just make a mess and clean it up like nothing happened?" Harold's confusion was genuine. "No, sir. I was just trying to—" "Shut up when I'm talking." The cafeteria had gone completely silent now. Even the kitchen workers had stopped moving. sensing the electricity in the air. 40 pairs of eyes watched as Mason stepped closer to the kneeling old man. This was the moment, the choice point where things could have gone differently, where a reasonable person would have walked away, where even a corrupt guard might have just issued a warning and moved on. Instead, Mason reached down and grabbed Harold's tray, dumping the remaining food across the floor. Scrambled eggs scattered like yellow confetti. Toast landed butter side down. The metal tray clattered against concrete. "Now you got a real mess to clean up, don't you?" Harold stared at the food scattered around him, his face a mask of quiet resignation. He had survived 73 years, buried a wife, lost his career, and landed in prison. He had learned when to fight and when to endure. This was a moment for endurance. He began picking up the scattered food with his trembling hands, placing pieces back on the tray with careful dignity. The Parkinsons made each movement a small struggle, but he persevered. That's when something inside Mason snapped completely. Maybe it was the old man's refusal to react with anger. Maybe it was the way Harold continued cleaning with quiet dignity while 40 prisoners watched. Maybe it was the feeling that his authority was being challenged by someone who should have been begging for mercy. Whatever the reason, Mason stepped forward and did something that crossed every line that existed in the unwritten code between guards and inmates. He slapped Harold Bennett across the face with enough force to knock the old man sideways onto the floor. The sound echoed through the cafeteria like a thunderclap. Not just the physical impact, but the violation of something deeper. Even in a place where violence was currency and brutality was routine, there were lines. Elderly inmates, like children, existed in a protected space that even the most hardened criminals respected. Mason had just shattered that protection in front of 40 witnesses. Harold lay on the floor for a moment, his cheek already swelling, his glasses knocked askew. When he looked up, there was something in his eyes that hadn't been there before. Not anger, not fear, something else entirely. Recognition, maybe. The understanding that he had just witnessed something that would demand an accounting. The guard stood over him, chest puffed with pride, that slow smirk spreading across his face like poison in still water. "That's how we keep order," he muttered, loud enough for everyone to hear. But order, real order, isn't maintained through fear alone. It requires respect, understanding, and the recognition that power comes with responsibility. Mason had just demonstrated that he understood none of these concepts. The 40 inmates who witnessed that slap weren't just random prisoners. They were a cross-section of Bridgewater's most dangerous residents. Men who had killed for less, men who had spent decades learning that respect was the only currency that mattered behind these walls. In the front corner sat Marcus "Tank" Williams, serving life for 3 counts of murder. His massive frame was covered in tattoos that told the story of 20 years inside the system. Tank had earned his nickname by crushing a man's skull with his bare hands during a prison riot in 2018. But even Tank had rules. Even Tank had lines he wouldn't cross. Near the serving line, Carlos Mendoza picked at his eggs with mechanical precision. The leader of the Latino faction at Bridgewater, Carlos controlled the drug trade in 3 cell blocks and commanded the loyalty of 60 men. His quiet authority came from a reputation built on calculated violence and unwavering principles. One of those principles was simple. You don't put hands on the elderly unless they put hands on you first. At a table by the windows, Jerome "Ice" Patterson sat frozen, his fork halfway to his mouth. Ice had gotten his nickname for his ability to stay calm under pressure, to think clearly when others lost their minds. He was serving 25 to life for armed robbery, but inside these walls, he was known as a problem solver, someone who could organize complex operations with the precision of a military campaign. These weren't soft men. These weren't inmates who cried themselves to sleep or wrote letters to girlfriends who had stopped visiting years ago. These were apex predators who had clawed their way to the top of the prison hierarchy through violence, intelligence, and an understanding of power that most people never needed to learn. But watching Officer Mason slap Harold Bennett had triggered something primal in each of them, a recognition that certain boundaries existed even in hell. As Harold struggled to his feet, his glasses hanging crooked on his face, the silence in the cafeteria stretched like a wire ready to snap. Mason stood over him, that satisfied smirk still playing across his lips, completely unaware that he had just signed his own death warrant. "Get this mess cleaned up," Mason barked, gesturing at the scattered food. "And next time, maybe you'll think twice before making me look bad in front of my inmates." The possessive tone sent another ripple through the watching crowd. In Mason's mind, these 40 dangerous men belonged to him. They were property to be managed, threats to be contained, animals to be controlled through fear and brutality. He was about to learn how wrong he was. Harold began collecting the scattered food once again, his trembling hands working slowly but steadily. The swelling on his cheek was already turning purple, a mark of shame that every inmate could see. But as he worked, something remarkable happened. Tank Williams stood up from his table, all 6'8", 300 pounds of him rising like a mountain coming to life. The movement caught Mason's attention, and for the first time since the confrontation began, uncertainty flickered across the guard's face. "Something wrong, Williams?" Mason asked, his voice carrying less confidence than before. Tank didn't answer immediately. Instead, he walked over to where Harold knelt on the floor and bent down. With surprising gentleness for such massive hands, he began helping the old man collect the scattered food. His movements were deliberate, respectful, sending a message that everyone in the cafeteria understood perfectly. Then Carlos Mendoza joined them, then Ice Patterson. One by one, the most dangerous men in Bridgewater State Correctional Facility knelt on that cafeteria floor to help an elderly embezzler clean up spilled eggs and toast. Mason watched this display with growing alarm. He had expected his show of force to reinforce his authority, to remind everyone who held the power in this place. Instead, he was witnessing something that terrified him more than any riot or gang fight ever could: unified defiance. "All right, that's enough," he said, his voice cracking slightly. "Everyone back to your tables. Show's over." But nobody moved. 40 inmates remained exactly where they were, some kneeling beside Harold, others standing in silent support. The message was clear. The show was just beginning. Mason reached for his radio, ready to call for backup, but Tank's voice stopped him cold. "Wouldn't do that if I were you, officer." The words were spoken quietly, without threat or anger. Just a statement of fact delivered with the casual confidence of someone who had spent 20 years learning how to read situations and calculate odds. "You see," Tank continued, still helping Harold to his feet, "calling for backup means admitting you lost control of your block, means explaining to the warden why 40 inmates are staging a peaceful protest because you decided to slap an old man with Parkinson's disease." The guard's face went pale. He was beginning to understand that his moment of violence had created a problem much larger than he had anticipated. These weren't random troublemakers looking for an excuse to cause chaos. These were organized, intelligent criminals who had just found a cause worth risking everything for. Carlos Mendoza spoke next, his accented English carrying the weight of absolute certainty. "My grandmother had the shaking sickness too before she died. Watching you put your hands on this old man, it brings back memories I don't like having." Ice Patterson nodded slowly. "See, Officer Mason, you made a mistake. You thought we were just animals in cages waiting for you to tell us what to do. But we're men, and men have lines they don't let other men cross." The cafeteria remained frozen in this strange tableau. 40 of the most dangerous criminals in the state system standing in solidarity with one elderly embezzler, while a single guard realized that his 8 years of unchecked brutality had finally caught up with him. Harold, now back on his feet with his glasses straightened, looked directly at Mason for the first time since the confrontation began. When he spoke, his voice was steady despite the swelling on his cheek. "Officer, I've been respectful to you since the day I arrived. I followed every rule, answered every question, caused you no trouble at all. But what you did here today, in front of these men, that's something that can't be undone." The old man's words carried a weight that seemed to settle over the entire cafeteria like dust after an explosion. This wasn't a threat. It wasn't even anger. It was simply an acknowledgement of reality. Actions have consequences, and some consequences can't be avoided once they've been set in motion. Mason looked around the room, suddenly aware that he was outnumbered 40 to 1, surrounded by men who had nothing left to lose and a new reason to hate him. His hand moved toward his radio again, then stopped. Tank was right. Calling for backup would mean admitting failure, would mean explaining to his supervisors why a routine morning had turned into a potential riot. Instead, he did what cowards do when confronted with the results of their own actions. He tried to salvage his authority through more threats. "You all better remember who's in charge here," he said, his voice shaking with false bravado. "This little show of solidarity won't protect any of you when the lights go out. I know where each of you sleeps. I know your schedules. I know everything about your pathetic little lives." The response was immediate and chilling. 40 men began to smile. Not the angry grins of people planning violence, but something far more dangerous. The quiet satisfaction of people who had just been given exactly what they needed to justify what they were already planning to do. Tank Williams leaned back against the wall, his massive arms crossed, and spoke with the calm of someone who had spent decades perfecting the art of measured violence. "You know what, Officer Mason? You just made this real simple for all of us." The guard's confidence was cracking like ice under pressure. He could see it in their faces now, the shift that happens when dangerous men stop seeing authority and start seeing opportunity. These weren't random inmates looking for trouble. This was a council of war forming right in front of him. "Simple how?" Mason asked. though something in his gut told him he didn't want to hear the answer. Ice Patterson stepped forward, his voice carrying that deadly calm that had earned him his nickname. Simple because you just showed us who you really are. 8 years you've been putting hands on people in dark corners, thinking nobody would ever call you on it. But today you got comfortable. Today you did it where everyone could see. Carlos Mendoza nodded slowly, his eyes never leaving Mason's face. Mi gente, we have a saying, el que siembra vientos, recoge tempestades. You plant wind, you harvest storms. Today, officer, you planted a hurricane. The guard's hand moved toward his radio again, but this time Tank's voice cut through the air like a blade. Go ahead, call them. Tell them you need backup because you assaulted an elderly man with a medical condition, and now the inmates are upset. See how that conversation goes with the warden. Mason froze. Tank was right, and they all knew it. Internal affairs investigations had destroyed careers over less. The prison system might tolerate brutality in the shadows, but public displays of violence against sympathetic victims were different, especially when witnessed by 40 men who could each tell the same story to any lawyer willing to listen. Harold, still standing with his swollen cheek and crooked glasses, spoke quietly. Officer Mason, I spent 40 years working in corporate accounting. I've seen what happens when people think the rules don't apply to them. The fall is always worse than they imagine. The words hung in the air like smoke from an explosion. This wasn't coming from Tank or Carlos or any of the men Mason had learned to fear. This was coming from a 73-year-old embezzler who should have been the easiest target in the room. You threatening me, old man? Mason snarled, but his voice lacked the conviction it had carried minutes earlier. Harold shook his head slowly. No, sir, I'm just observing. You see, I've learned something in my 7 decades on this earth. Power without wisdom is just destruction waiting for its moment. And destruction always finds its moment. The cafeteria remained frozen in this strange standoff. 40 dangerous men arranged like chess pieces around one elderly inmate and one increasingly desperate guard. But the real game was happening in the spaces between words, in the looks being exchanged, in the silent communications that flowed between men who had learned to plan without speaking. Jerome Patterson caught Tank's eye and gave an almost imperceptible nod toward the kitchen. Tank's massive head tilted slightly in acknowledgement. Carlos noticed the exchange and let his gaze drift toward the corridor leading to the cell blocks. The message was clear without a single word being spoken. They were already thinking 3 moves ahead. Mason, trained to spot brewing trouble, recognized the signs too late. The silence wasn't just defiance anymore. It was coordination, organization. These men were using his moment of brutality as the foundation for something much larger than a cafeteria confrontation. All right, everyone back to your tables, Mason said, his voice carrying none of its earlier authority. Breakfast is over. Time to clear out. Nobody moved. The guard looked around desperately, realizing that his 8 years of accumulated authority had just evaporated in the space of a single slap. Every threat he had made, every fear he had cultivated, every moment of intimidation he had built his reputation on meant nothing now. He had crossed the line, and everyone in that room knew it. Tank spoke again, his voice carrying across the silent cafeteria like a judge reading a verdict. You know what the real problem is, officer? You thought we were just animals, thought we'd forgotten what it means to be men, thought we'd watch you put hands on an old man and just go back to our cells like nothing happened. He paused, letting the words sink in before continuing. But see, we remember things. We remember respect. We remember honor. We remember that some things are worth fighting for, even in a place like this. Carlos stepped closer, his movements fluid and controlled. In my neighborhood growing up, we had a code. You protect the children, you protect the elderly, you protect those who cannot protect themselves. That code don't disappear just because we're behind these walls. Ice nodded in agreement. My grandfather fought in Korea, came home with medals and nightmares. But he taught me something important. He said the measure of a man isn't how he treats his equals or his superiors. It's how he treats those who have no power to fight back. Mason was beginning to understand that he hadn't just slapped an old man. He had violated something fundamental in the social order that these men had constructed for themselves. Even in prison, even among murderers and drug dealers and armed robbers, there were rules, lines that didn't get crossed. And he had just crossed the biggest one of all. Harold wiped a small trickle of blood from the corner of his mouth, his trembling hands steadier now than they had been all morning. Officer, I want you to know something. I don't wish you harm. I'm not an angry man, and I'm too old to carry grudges. But what you did here today, that's between you and these gentlemen now. I'm just the reason they're going to do what they were already thinking about doing. The old man's words sent a chill down Mason's spine that had nothing to do with the prison's perpetual cold. This wasn't about revenge anymore. This was about justice, prison style, and Harold had just given them permission to deliver it. "You're all going to regret this," Mason said, but the words sounded hollow even to him. "I know every one of your files. I know your families, your visitors, your parole dates. I can make your lives hell." Tank's laugh was like rocks grinding together. "Officer, you still don't get it. Our lives are already hell. That's why we're here. But you got a house to go home to. You got a family. You got a life outside these walls. Which one of us really has more to lose?" The threat was implicit but unmistakable. Mason had spent 8 years believing that his position gave him immunity, that the badge and the uniform made him untouchable. But badges don't stop sharpened toothbrushes, uniforms don't deflect boiling water mixed with sugar, and authority means nothing when 40 men decide that the rules have changed. Carlos spoke next, his voice carrying the weight of absolute certainty. "You know what's going to happen now, officer. You're going to walk out of this cafeteria. You're going to finish your shift. You're going to go home to your family and try to forget what happened here today. But you won't forget, because every time you walk these corridors, every time you make your rounds, you're going to remember that you crossed a line you can't uncross." Ice Patterson picked up the thread seamlessly. "And every day you come to work, you're going to wonder if today's the day. If today's the day someone decides that what you did to Harold was worth settling. If today's the day 40 men stop talking and start acting." The psychological warfare was surgical in its precision. They weren't threatening immediate violence. They were promising something worse: the slow erosion of safety, the gradual understanding that protection is an illusion, the creeping paranoia that comes with knowing you've made enemies of people who have nothing left to lose. Mason looked around the cafeteria one more time, seeing 40 faces that would haunt his dreams for years to come. He had started his shift thinking he was in control. Now he understood that control in a place like this was always temporary, always conditional, always dependent on the consent of the people you thought you were controlling. Harold stepped forward, his movement causing every man in the room to tense slightly. "Officer Mason, I want to tell you something my father told me when I was young. He said that a man's character isn't defined by his worst moment, but by what he does after that moment passes. You have a choice now. You can double down on the path that brought you here, or you can find a different way forward." The offer of redemption was unexpected, gracious in a way that made Mason's earlier brutality seem even more shameful by comparison. Here was a man who had been publicly humiliated and physically assaulted, offering his attacker a chance to choose a different path. But redemption requires humility, and humility was something Derek Mason had never learned. Instead of accepting the olive branch, he sneered at the old man one final time. "Save your philosophy for someone who cares, old-timer. This isn't over. Not by a long shot." Tank shook his massive head slowly, like a father disappointed in a child who refused to learn from their mistakes. "No, officer. You're right about one thing. This isn't over. This is just the beginning." The guard turned and walked toward the cafeteria exit, his boots echoing against the concrete floor with each step. But the sound wasn't the confident stride of authority anymore. It was the hollow footsteps of a man walking toward an uncertain future, knowing that he had just made enemies of people who specialized in long-term planning and patient revenge. As the door swung shut behind him, the 40 inmates remained exactly where they were for several more seconds. The silence stretched like a held breath, pregnant with possibility and dark promise. Then slowly, they began to disperse. But the conversations that started as they walked back to their cells weren't about breakfast or work details or the weather. They were about justice, about respect, about the debt that had just been incurred, and the interest that would compound with each passing day. Harold remained in the cafeteria longer than the others, methodically cleaning up the last remnants of his spilled breakfast. His movements were careful, dignified, the same quiet grace he had maintained throughout the entire confrontation. Tank approached him as he finished, extending one massive hand to help the old man to his feet. "You all right, Harold?" The elderly embezzler touched his swollen cheek gingerly, then nodded. "I've been better, but I'll survive. Thank you for what you did here. All of you. I know it wasn't really about me." Tank's smile was grim but genuine. "It was about you, Harold, but it was about more than you too. Some things can't be allowed to stand, even in a place like this. Especially in a place like this." As they walked toward the exit together, Harold asked quietly, "What happens now?" Tank was quiet for a long moment, his mind already working through possibilities, calculating risks and opportunities. When he finally spoke, his voice carried the weight of inevitability. "Now, Harold, we teach Officer Mason something he should have learned a long time ago. We teach him that actions have consequences, and some consequences last a lifetime." The old man nodded slowly, understanding that he had just witnessed the beginning of something that would echo through the corridors of Bridgewater State Correctional Facility for years to come. He had come to prison expecting to serve his time quietly, to count down the days until his release in obscurity. Instead, he had become the catalyst for something much larger, something that would test every assumption about power, respect, and justice behind these concrete walls. As they walked back toward the cell blocks, the wheels were already turning. 40 dangerous men had just found a common cause, and Derek Mason had given them all the justification they needed to act on it. The first move came at 3:47 a.m., when the night shift was at its thinnest and the surveillance cameras had their predictable blind spots. Mason was making his rounds, flashlight cutting through the darkness of cell block C, when he heard it. The sound of metal scraping against concrete, slow and deliberate. His hand moved instinctively to his radio, but something made him pause. The sound stopped. Silence returned, thick and oppressive. He told himself it was nothing. Pipes settling, wind through the ventilation system, the kind of sounds that old buildings make in the dead of night. But his gut knew better. His gut understood that 40 men with nothing to lose had spent the last 6 hours planning something that would make his worst nightmares seem like pleasant dreams. The second sign came during the next morning's count. Mason stood at his station, clipboard in hand, calling off numbers as inmates lined up outside their cells. But something was different. The usual grumbling and shuffling was replaced by an eerie compliance. Men who normally took their time responding to orders snapped to attention immediately. Tank Williams stood perfectly straight, his massive frame filling his cell doorway. Carlos Mendoza had his hands clasped behind his back, like a soldier at inspection. Ice Patterson met Mason's eyes directly, his expression unreadable but somehow threatening in its perfect calm. "Everything seems unusually quiet this morning," Mason muttered to Officer Rodriguez, the day shift supervisor. The quiet compliance lasted exactly 72 hours. That's how long it took for 40 dangerous men to coordinate a response that would echo through every prison in the state system. When Mason walked into his shift that Thursday night, he found his locker stuffed with newspaper clippings about guard brutality cases. No threats, no angry messages, just documentation of what happened to officers who forgot their place. By Friday morning, Mason had requested a transfer to the minimum security facility across town. By Friday afternoon, his request was approved with suspicious speed. The warden understood that some problems solved themselves if you let them. Harold Bennett served the remaining 14 months of his sentence without incident. He was released on a Tuesday morning in spring, walking through those same steel gates that had seemed so intimidating 18 months earlier. But he wasn't the same man who had entered. He carried himself differently now, straighter, stronger. 3 weeks after his release, Harold received a letter with no return address. Inside was a single photograph, 40 men standing together in the prison yard, looking directly at the camera. On the back, someone had written in careful handwriting, "Some lessons last forever." Officer Derek Mason never worked in corrections again. He took a job at a hardware store in a town 3 states away, where nobody knew his name or his story. But on quiet nights, when the store was empty and shadows stretched long across the aisles, he still heard the sound of metal scraping against concrete. He still saw 40 faces watching him with patient, calculating eyes. That's the thing about crossing lines you can't uncross. The consequences don't always come when you expect them, but they always come. And sometimes the most powerful punishment isn't violence at all. Sometimes it's the knowledge that 40 dangerous men will remember your name long after you've forgotten theirs.